memory, which keeps its own calendar, led the hand back from ruins to beginnings and set the tale to unfolding again with clearer edges, river light turning on the faces of settlers in the northern Lurs, palms powdered with clay as women-shaped jars whose spirals remembered eddies in the yellow river, millet smoked sweet under a cold wind while farther south seedlings stood ankle-deep in warm water and the voice of a heron counted the rows. In that long dawn the house grew from pit to platform, from woven wall to stamped earth, and the village drew a belt of ditches around itself like a man tightening his robe before work. Pot spoke first, red with painted bands, then a darker ware thin enough to answer a tap with a note. Beads of bone and shell traveled from coast to plain, dogs curled near hearths, pigs rooted where husks lay, and the line between wild and tame drew closer to the gate with each season. Villages on the northern plain traded stories and stone, then copper, then the heavier promise of bronze, and in time the ground began to yield a new grammar, ritual vessels with beast masks whose eyes peered from curls and whirls, squat tripods crouched on 3 legs, square-mouthed jars whose angles held command. When heat split tortoise plastron and ox shoulder the branching cracks were reed like lightning that had agreed to sit still long enough to be understood, and questions once shouted to the sky learned to kneel upon a table of polished wood. Kingship thickened around such tables. In halls raised on packed earth the ruler's breath fell in cadence with the bell line, bronze mouths struck in descending ranks until sound stepped downward like terraces and settled among kneeling courtiers. Spears stood along the walls as storks stand in a field before storm, chariots waited with wheels bound in metal and axles slick with fat, and the storehouses beyond the rampart were full enough to quiet prophecy for a season. Under the floors, tomb shafts bit down into shadow, chambers panelled with timber received lacquered coffins and tiers of bright vessels, jade by lay cool against still chests, dagger axes and bows accompanied hands that would never again draw or thrust, teams of horses stamped once and fell silent. Above ground the city's plan gathered itself around a north-south axis, gates oriented to the 4 beasts of heaven, ceremonial ways broad enough for a king's car to roll like a small sun. Beyond the palisade lay fields parcelled by canal and ridge, and beyond those fields the dusk where enemies rehearsed their courage. From the west the plateau sent hard men with the desert in their eyes, teaching speed and the price of delay. From the north a people of grass and sky darkened the horizon with dust and arrows. From the south bamboo forests hid ambush and viper alike. From the east the sea kept repeating patience until even war learned to breathe. The great house answered by drawing its web tighter, a hierarchy of lords bound by oath and blood, domains granted like collars with cords attached, the center sending rights and receiving tribute, giving bronze and asking grain, bestowing bells and demanding men. Law entered the courtyard as another god to be fed. Tablets defined how far a canal might steal a neighbor's water, how many blows matched an insult, how long a widow must grieve before she could braid her hair for new vows, the rod, the exile path, the confiscation writ all hung on pegs in the judge's mind, and behind his mind stood altars, for no sentence had weight unless the dead heard it. Over this fabric a different authority spread like clear frost, the idea that heaven bends no knee yet confers a strand of its order on one man at a time, that when harvests ripen and rivers stay within their banks the strand lies firm, and when plague walks the roads and wolves look down from city walls the strand has slipped and must be taken up by other hands. In that thought lay both obedience and revolt. Thrones became seats one might either inherit or merit, and the drum that summoned levies to defend the border could in another year beat the march that ended a dynasty. Warfare answered with invention. Chariots mastered the plain, but new ranks of foot learned to stand in depth and trade the reach of a spear for the patience of a wall of men. Wrappings of lacquer and leather stiffened into lamella coats, the bow grew in power and the quarrel learned to fly true from a stock of wood and horn. Signals multiplied, flags for advance, for feint, for encirclement. Drums countered the heartbeats of maneuvers as precisely as irrigation gates countered the fall of water. Fortified towns rose like knuckles along disputed lines, and long barriers stitched hill to keep a winter sky of arrows from falling upon spring fields. While armies tested one another, the civility behind them grew subtle as silk. Markets thickened along river bends, the talk of muleteers braided provinces into one rug of rumor, strings of cash clicked like small rain in a good, and salt moved with the authority of scripture. Silk carried the touch of mulberry leaves from valley to desert, metals passed hand to hand with the cold assurance of mountain bone. Lacquer made would remember the look of water, porcelain, when the kilns learned the exact hunger of their own heat, held moonlight in a bowl. Roads ran straight as the will that decreed them, bridges taught rivers the courtesy of delay, relay stations measured distance in fresh horses and steam from the mouths of messengers. Weights and measures were made to agree whether one bought millet in the shadow of a northern wall or fish sauce where the air tasted of mangrove. Even the script learned unity. Brush and knife drew the same bones of meaning across provinces that did not otherwise forgive each other quickly, and the counting of time itself, calendars binding lunar breath to solar spine, gave kings the power to name auspicious days for birth, for marriage, for war. Ambition knit these strands into empire. A sovereign took the map into his hand as if it were a sheath and pushed his blade of law through its whole length, borders hammered flat, coin stamped with a single face, roads flung like javelins from capital to quarter, titles melted and recast so that loyalty owed no memory but the present. He made mountains bow where needed with cuttings and ramps, made rivers learn new manners with dikes and sluices, made men's feet know the measure of 1,000 paces as if it were a hymn. He feared what words could do and loved what stone could promise, so he gathered scholars into ranks and set masons to work without sleep. He distrusted the past but craved the future's verdict, and to that verdict he offered monuments whose shadows still move with the sun. His rule burned white and brief, and when it went out the night smelled of ash, yet the ash fertilized the ground for a longer peace. The next great house unrolled its banners with a calmer hand, drew settlers into new lands with canals and grants, bound the border with garrisons, and sent caravans outward along a road of thirst and wind where oases hung like green lamps. Horses from far grass met silk from near rivers, glass and spices answered jade and paper, instruments that could listen to underground thunder sat in halls where astronomers walked the ceiling with their eyes and brought stars down into orderly cages. Villages under that long order learned the luxury of continuity. A boy who hoed the same field his grandfather had hoed could hope to wear a belt of office if his brush learned the weight of the classics and his memory learned when to bow and when to stand. A girl who spun silk for a household altar might one day see her weaving admired in a hall where drums once spoke only of war. The year's curve steadied, and the dead were fed punctually, and the rice spirits forgave small errors because the large pattern was kept. Yet peace never forgot the price of itself. On the northern plain a rider could always appear at dusk with the cold promise of distance in his posture. On the southern rivers fever could always rise like a slow mist with teeth. In the west, passes could close as a hand closes, swallowing whole caravans. In the east the sea waited with its patient lesson that ships are only arguments with weather. Courts remembered this and did not let the arm become soft. Foundries sang at night. Arrows slept in their quivers like a well-drilled silence. Orders went out along straight roads with the speed of light turned to hoof and wheel. The heart of the realm beat through its writing hand. Characters inked upon strips and rolls gathered the will of many rains into one river, instructions to tax and spare, to build and forbid, to teach and punish, to call a man forward and send him away. Histories braided the lives of rulers with omens in the sky and floods on the plain until meaning sat like a magistrate over accident. Songs captured the pulse of planting and reaping, of parting at the ferry and returning in rain. And somewhere behind all the voices a single intention persisted. That memory should be longer than any crown. The ark that had carried the people from painted jars to bronze thunder, from clan meetings under eaves to examinations under torchlight, from banks held in place by wattled brush to embankments that treated rivers like beasts on halters, reached its midday and began to lean. But decline in one house became apprenticeship for another. Borders broken were redrawn like lines in wet sand. Princes went into exile and returned with grim patience. Soldiers learned to live off the earth when granaries failed. Commoners built secret networks of obligation that outlasted commanders. Through it all the rites remained, the bow before the family tablet, the cup poured to the ground before the first mouthful, the careful avoidance of words that might trip the dead into jealousy, the taboo days when axes rested and the forest breathed without fear. If there was an essence that could not be conquered, it was the habit of giving shape, to water with a ditch, to time with a calendar, to fate with a vow, to grief with a ceremony, to memory with a stone. And so the tale that began with clay and river light returns to clay and river light, the same hand pressing earth into a form the future will understand when it cuts downward with a spade, the same current reflecting a face that belongs to a living child and to an ancestor at once. What kings hammered together and enemies broke apart, what courts codified and rebels torched, what famine thinned and prosperity fattened, all of it survives where bronze keeps its tone after centuries of sleep, where jade keeps its cool against a chest that no longer rises, where brick keeps its mortar line through 1,000 rains, where writing keeps its bones though sound changes its clothes. The story does not end, it rests between breaths. If the land is asked again, it will answer in the same languages: earth, metal, water, fire, wind, and in the same images: dragon cloud over a paddy at dusk, plough handle smooth from 3 generations, a bell whose note folds a courtyard into stillness, a road that runs arrow straight through wheat, a wall that tastes the north wind and refuses to move. From such things a people recognizes itself and continues, and from such recognition the next name for order will rise, and the next, until the ages themselves seem like kings on a procession road, each glittering for an hour, each leaving dust that feeds the field. Clay remembers the first agreements better than speech does. In villages along the river bends the hands that once shaped pots for porridge learned to pull walls upward until the clay held its own height, and rims widened like horizons to catch the steam of millet and rice. Red jars painted with fish and spirals gave way to vessels darker and thinner, their sides ringing softly when tapped, the sound a proof that patience had been fired into them. Lugs for cords were set at the shoulders, feet raised the bellies from the ash, covers nested like moons upon mouths. A household could be known by the line of its pottery the way a face is known by its brow and chin. When a jar cracked, the crack was stitched with metal staples. When a favorite pot finally failed, a shard was kept on a shelf as if it still breathed. From clay the hand moved to earth itself. Walls were rammed until they were hard as old roots, courtyards squared to the compass, terraces cut along slopes to step the hills into obedience. City gates bit into the wind with mouths of wood sheathed in bronze, watchtowers leaned forward, listening, streets ran straight where the ruler loved order and curved where the land insisted on its own speech. Underfoot the ground hid drains and culverts so that rain learned the manners of a guest, and above, roofs tiled like fish backs shed storm after storm without forgetting how to shine when the sun returned. Bronze arrived as a second language, heavier but more eloquent. It took the mountains' veins and taught them ceremony, tripods with swollen bellies and short, proud legs, square vessels whose corners grip power, kettles with looped handles worn smooth by hands that fed gods and men alike, beasts in low relief whose staring eyes watched feasts and judgments with the same implacable calm. Masks crept from curl and hook, jaws clenched on the rims, horns unfurling from pattern to presence, the vessel's skin became a field where thunder animals grazed. Bells learned to speak in choirs. Hung in tiers from wooden frames they stepped their tones from thunder to rain, from command to blessing, each tongue answering mallet and air with a mouthful of bronze time. When a court summoned the world into harmony, the bells laid the road. When a king sought courage, the bells stacked courage in layers until warriors felt taller inside their armor. In the foundries fire ruled, but fire was fettered. Clay molds wrapped the wax of intention, cords bound the seams, vents and gates were cut like veins in a god's arm, then metal poured, a river the color of sunset's core. When the molds were broken the new shape stood steaming in the night, and the smith's breath steadied as if a prayer had been answered. Seams were chased, patterns sharpened, surfaces rubbed until they took the light like still water. The casting yards smelled of charcoal and clay and wet hide, hammers ticked like insects, boys carried sand and men carried promise. Jade made a cooler covenant. It did not melt, it yielded only to sand and water and the stubbornness of decades. Discs with open hearts slid on cords across chests that no longer rose, tubes squared at the corners embraced the wrists of the silent, small cicadas lay between teeth to remind the mouth that a second spring awaits those who sleep well. Jade was the mountain kept in the hand, it took on the warmth of the body and returned it as a memory of snow. Shells traveled inland and became bracelets, bone turned to combs and pins, ivory kept a pale moon within itself after journeys no one alive could recount. Cloth learned brilliance. Hemp took the color of river mud and labor, honest and coarse, good for sacks and sails. Silk took the color of sunrise caught in mist, fine enough to slide through a ring, strong enough to ride 1,000 miles in a thulbag without fraying. On silk, brushes walked, lines that looked like reeds and yet meant law, strokes that looked like wings and yet meant names. Before brush there had been cracks, heat on bone and shell, fissures flowering outward like winter trees, their branches red as answers. After brush there were inscriptions coiled within bronze bellies and running along their lips, tidy bones of language gripping metal like ivy grips a wall. Wood glistened beneath lacquer until wood forgot it was mortal. Boxes sealed sweetness against damp, cups carried an autumn forest to the lip, masks took rain's patience into their shine and wore it to ceremonies where faces needed the authority of beasts. Lacquer dried slow as deliberation and, like deliberation, resisted worm and weather alike. Iron arrived late to the feast and sat down as if it had always been expected. Plows bit deeper, axes spoke a harder syllable to the tree, knives kept their edge past dusk. But bronze remained the tongue of ritual even when iron grew strong in the fields and at the gates. The gods had learned the flavor of bronze smoke and were not about to change their hunger. Houses learned to stand above ground on packed platforms, floors smoothed with lime held the cool of mornings, pillars wore collars of carved stone to keep their feet dry in flood. Windows were cut high to invite light but not thieves, doors faced south to greet warmth, screens turned draught into song. A rich home was a small country, granaries like hills, wells like lakes, a family shrine that was its own mountain. Tools multiplied, each with private intention. Weights that agreed from city to city, measures whose rods made truth visible, seals that pressed a man's authority into wet clay and left it there like the track of an animal too heavy to mistake. Coins learned to fit the hand and the mind at once, things that had been spades and knives in memory shrank into symbols, and round pieces with square hearts began to count the world into neat piles. Harness pieces of bronze told the horse he was beautiful and a servant both, chariot linchpins with lion heads grinned through dust and blood, arrowheads nested in bundles, quiet as teeth wrapped in cloth. Kilns figured out the exact thirst of their own fire and turned clay so white and hard that it rang when struck, glazes crawled over forms like water finding its level, bowls captured a moon and kept it, ears held a river and poured it as if they had invented pouring. Music needed homes, and craftsmen obliged, zithers whose strings kept a valley's rumour taut, flutes whose notes tasted of pine shade, drums whose skins remembered herds at pasture, stone chimes hung in frames that knew how to breathe. When the set was tuned, the court had a ladder it could climb from earth to order and descend again without misstep. Even war learned refinement. Armor plates laced in tears moved like a fish under a man's shirt, helmets took crests that widened fear before steel ever spoke, quivers were cases for both death and pride. Standards bore beasts that had never been seen but always been known, and the stitching of a banner could decide whether a column walked like a thought or stumbled like an excuse. Nothing stood alone. The bronze tripod needed the clay pit that birthed its mold, the clay pit needed the ditch that kept its water sweet, the ditch needed the slope cut where a surveyor had taught string and weight to listen to gravity. A palace meal reached back to miners whose lamps guttered in the throat of a hill, to charcoal burners whose pits smoked in forests where no one sang, to potters whose hands could find center without looking. When a vessel was placed on an altar, 10,000 other acts placed their shadows beside it. Burials kept score with more certainty than ledgers. A shaft lined with timber, a lacquered coffin painted red and black, a pair of bells at the head, a brace of blades at the side, jars like moons in a row, bead strands coiling where a throat had been, the bit of a horse greening quietly in its last mouth, such arrangements told the living how power had been stacked in daylight. In poorer graves the language was shorter but not mute, a single pot with a careful lip, a knife ground thin with work, a shell from a coast the owner never saw. The dead lie still, but their rooms speak. Town plan spoke too. A city that faced a cardinal line wished to teach the sky that it had been understood, a city that bent to a river's whim wished to teach men that grace might serve order better than stubbornness. Moats argued with siege ladders in the calculus of fear, posterns held the option of mercy or betrayal. Storehouses set like teeth along an avenue told raiders to consider their appetite. Over centuries the grammar of forms traveled farther than the kings who ordered them. A jar from the north sat in a southern kitchen. A tripod pattern walked into a valley where it had never before kept a god company. A bell from the frontier taught the capital a note it had lacked. So the land's handwriting repeated itself with variations, and any man who could read with his fingers as well as his eyes could tell where a thing wished to be and where it had come from. The river kept testing the banks, the wind kept testing the roofs, the press of mouths kept testing the granaries. Under those tests goods learned to move. Salt left its white beds for provinces that had never tasted the sea, horses left grasslands for cities that needed speed, silk left patient looms for deserts that honored brilliance, copper, tin, and iron walked in caravans until they forgot which mountain had fathered them. With every exchange a custom rode pillion on a bale, a word hid in a saddle, a tune curled up in a merchant's ear and uncurled itself by a strange fire. Forms shifted as they traveled. Pottery took a new shoulder, a blade borrowed a new angle, a roof tiling learned to lock its scales against a different kind of rain. Behind the changes stood both hunger and invitation, a flood in one valley, a rumor of richer soil in another, a winter too long, a wall too low, a peace that made a marcher's feet itch, a threat that made a farmer's back turn nomad. And so the objects that tell time like stones also tell movement like birds, their flight lines crossing on the map until the country looks like a net thrown across a restless sea. Seasons pressed their seals upon the map and men followed the ink. Years of too much water loosened villages from their banks and sent them downstream, years of too little sent them searching for springs in hills that had never known a plough. On the northern plain wind lifted Lurse like a veil and set it down again in waves that swallowed old furrows and asked for new. Southward the air grew heavy and sweet, and rice paddies called to families whose memories were sown with millet, offering a harvest if they would learn the art of standing ankle-deep in mirrored fields. Clans packed their altars and carried them with the grain jars. Banners kept shape against rain while names frayed and re-wove, marriages stitched strangers into kin as surely as bridges stitched banks. Riders came out of distances the settled could not imagine, thin and hard and laughing at fences. They took what they wanted and sometimes stayed, and the children of those winters learned both saddle and hoe. Caravans wound through river gates and mountain doors, treading paths that were themselves forms of law. When they stopped in a valley for more than one season the path thickened into a road and a road into a boundary, and the boundary demanded a keeper with a spear and a drum. In the mouths of wanderers the old tale of the flood learned 100 new bends. A man with rough hands cut channels for a river that had forgotten its duty, another taught fire to cook rather than devour, another found herbs not to charm a god but to soothe a child, another traced constellations across the dark so that travelers could argue with night. These were set as the first rulers in memory's court not because they commanded armies but because they made survival obey. Their names were less proper nouns than titles of gratitude, and under those titles later kings tried on virtue like armor and sometimes found that it fit. Where movement slowed, order crystallized. Villages that had long made decisions by the weight of an elder's gaze began to summon wider councils. The circle under the eaves became a hall with pillars, and the low stool became a dais. A household swollen with cousins became a lineage swollen with lineages became a clan, the cluster of clans became a district that required overseers who could read tally marks and who knew how to keep their tempers when men shouted about ditches. The headman learned to send messengers, the messenger learned to carry a token that could not be forged, and the token learned to carry the fact of authority from door to door faster than the man himself could walk. Land was measured in paces that repeated themselves from valley to valley, harvests were counted in baskets that agreed with one another, the field itself acquired boundaries you could not see but that everyone could feel, lines drawn by the ritual calendar as much as by cord and stake. At the top of this structure the figure of the king sharpened. He did what the elder had always done, decide whose word was stronger, but he did it for towns that had never tasted each other's water, for men who could not understand each other's speech. He married victory to ceremony, because the spear alone could seize a province but only the drum and bell could persuade it to stay. He sat in fast before declaring a levy, not from softness but from certainty that troops march straighter when heaven's silence has been consulted. The palace was his fortress and his sermon both, in it grain became tax, quarrel became judgment, omen became decree. Around him ranked officers whose duties made a wheel, the keeper of measures, the captain of gates, the master of horse, the reader of cracks, the tallyman, the steward of granaries, the commander who slept in his armor like a resolved thought. Beneath them stood ranks that reached the dirt, farmers whose backs kept the calendar true, artisans whose hands taught stubborn materials to accept intention, carters and boatmen who gave legs to policy, hunters who fed garrisons when roads washed out, and under all, those who had been taken in war and did not choose their labor. The law entered slowly, as seed enters earth, not a book fallen from the sky but rules learned from repetition and enforced by embarrassment, fear, and habit until even the stubborn included them in their prayers. A ditch stolen by stealth must be returned with public shame, a debt forgiven in a famine must not be demanded in a flood, a widow must be protected long enough for her dead husband's house to keep its name, a soldier must be paid even in defeat, because ruin grows fastest in a belly that has been promised and then betrayed. Penalties learned weights like market goods, so many blows for a theft of so much grain, exile for a repeated offense, death for the knife raised against a superior, amputation or branding where rulers believed memory worked best when it had a scar to point to. But there were gifts set across from penalties, remissions when the sky misbehaved, pardons when a Levi had emptied the fields, posts granted to men who proved quick with a brush and steady with a conscience, fields granted to those who had stood in the front rank when the enemy's chariots came on like weather. Custom braided itself through this apparatus like a living vine, the bow a man must give and receive to remain a man, the door through which a bride enters so that her feet learn the boards they will rule, the length of mourning that teaches a household that love outlives bread, the taboo days when iron should sleep, the way a guest is seated so that he understands precisely how welcome he is. Rank showed in clothing, in the cut of a sleeve, in the colonnade's shadows, in the distance allowed between a man's body and the throne's foot. Speech itself obeyed height, words climbed toward the king like steps, rough, then smooth, then careful, then flat and shining like water on stone. Beneath all order lay the altar. Every household had a board before which the living poured wine to the dead, a corner of the room where smoke brought two worlds into one. Every village had a shrine shaded by trees older than any memory in the village, ropes hung from branches to remind men that a boundary invisible to the eye is the only boundary that matters. Every district had a place where drums conversed with mountain and river and waited for answers. Every court had rooms where the bones and shells slept until fire woke them into speech. The people did not think of gods as strangers, they thought of them as neighbors who must be greeted properly, lest a fence be trampled or a field be flooded out of simple irritation. Dragons lived where water lived, tigers kept the West's dignity at the edge of marsh and forest, a bird with fire in its feathers visited when renewal was near, a tortoise with the patience of stone-balanced stars on its back. The sky itself, silent and implacable, listened from a height no ladder could reach. From it the ruler's right descended like a thread that might be knotted or cut, and men judged the tightness of that thread in wheat and wind, in how often funerals outnumbered weddings in a season. Diviners stood between anxiety and act. They heated turtle shell until the surface cracked into hieroglyphs of decision. They fed small flames with scented wood until the smoke coiled either toward favor or away from it. They watched birds not for beauty but for grammar. They counted thunders. They read frost. They tested wells. Priests wore skins and bells and masks when the village needed spectacle. They wore plain hemp when the village needed reassurance. They whispered in the ears of chiefs the way rain whispers in bamboo, relentless, patient, persuasive. Sages without altars taught by example, refusing command while proving fit to wield it, and their image traveled from school to school until even generals quoted gentleness to excuse necessity. Sacrifice ordered fear. Grain burned sweet to thank the unseen for a harvest, a black pig soothed the river after a drowning, a bull fed the guest who is not a guest, wine arced in libation before throats were allowed to drink. The dead were given new meals at precise intervals lest they grow thin and dangerous. The newborn were introduced to ancestors lest they grow wild and unclaimed. Marriages braided not just houses but altars, so that the same smoke could find the names on two different boards. The city's great rites mirrored the household's small ones and taught ambition to bow. When the ruler climbed the terrace at New Year to meet the dawn, the realm felt the hinge of the year turn without grinding. When he fasted before sending armies, even men at the last milepost believed their feet would find a rhythm that matched heaven. When he buried his parents with music, courtiers remembered that triumph must not be louder than mourning. Under such disciplines the spirit of the people learned to move as a whole. Soldiers marched to drum patterns that echoed temple choirs, scribes timed decree with season, markets opened and closed with the moon, the plough bit earth on days when spirits were said to be kindly, roads avoided graves not from fear alone but from the knowledge that a nation crosses itself whenever it forgets the place where its dead lie. And as belief bound things into an unseen architecture, war came to test its beams, not to unhouse it. For faith armed a man before iron did, and the image on a banner could strike the heart a blink sooner than a spear could find the body. A reputation for inviolable oaths could save a garrison that 10,000 arrows would only waste. When such currents joined, movement that thickened into settlement, settlement that crystallized into order, order that deepened into right, the realm stood not merely as a territory but as a meaning. From that meaning the armies took their confidence, the granaries their calendar, the workshops their measure, the schools their texts, and the music its pitch, and from that same meaning the shadows gathered that would in later ages lengthen into decline. But before shadow there must be height, and the height was built by hands that had learned to place stone upon stone with the patience of prayer, by knees that had learned when to bend and when to brace, by voices that had learned to be quiet long enough for bells to speak. War made its own grammar from the materials that peace supplied, and the realm learned each tense until command could be spoken without shouting. Scouts with eyes like needles stitched the edges of maps with tidings caught at wells and ferry stones, and their news ran ahead of armies as smell runs ahead of rain. Camps unrolled like markets in a storm, lines squared to ditch and ramp, cook fires in ranks as neat as infantry, horses watered by schedule and rubbed until their coats shone like lacquer. The chariot still drew the eye, its axle song bright on the plain, but the foot line became the province of patience, shields overlapped, spears angled like winter reeds, archers stood behind with cords taut to that private music the fingers keep, and the commander wrote on the field with blocks of men as if with heavy brush, turning, thickening, thinning, letting a silence run along the front before striking it like a drumhead. Night ceased to belong only to fear, signal lamps crept over hillsides, drums with muffled throats counted dark maneuvers, and surprise learned to dress in discipline. Walls answered with stubbornness perfected by generations. Earthworks rose with faces stone had taught to be calm, towers looked outward without blinking, parapets invited the surefoot and punished the clumsy. A city could hold a season if its wells drank from veins no engine could cut, and its granaries remembered 2 bad harvests instead of 1. Beyond the ditch, attackers built their own small country of rams and mantlets, trenches and fascines, patience and rage. Between them floated speeches painted on banners, beasts whose claws stretched farther than any spear, dragon for authority that coils and strikes, tiger for courage that wastes no motion, bird of fire for renewal after ash, tortoise for the long intention that outlives storms. The enemy's heart often felt these before his body did, and men counted that as victory earned without waste. Prisoners were weighed as carefully as grain, for the use of a captive could be finer than the edge that took him. Some were turned to guides, some to messengers whose return was a promise, some to proof that mercy had not been banished from the camp. When mercy failed, swiftness spoke in its place, and the ground learned again the old lesson that blood is a seed for both hatred and obedience. From the smoke of sieges and the dust of marches the road of wealth broadened, for conquest without carts is a boast without breath. Canals braided provinces that had once ignored one another, and their measured fall of water taught even hills to serve. Sluice gates lifted and the plain greened as if a single hand had painted it. In the dry season the same gates held back enough future to keep the present steady. Warehouses learned to breathe, cool in summer and dry in rain, and the tally staff grew its notches until the staff itself became a number. Salt came in cakes stamped with certainty, iron in bars whose weight felt like promise, paper in sheets that made memory lighter than bamboo and quicker than clay. Caravans wore the patience of the West like a cloak, step by counted step from oasis to oasis where palms whispered the arithmetic of distance. River fleets wore the ease of the South, sail and current tutoring each other until cargo moved as if of its own will. Inns learned to keep 2 kinds of light, one for gossip and one for sleep, and in their courtyards tongues traded more than coin, a proverb learned a new ending, a tune went home on a mule's back, a measure discovered it could fit 2 markets without lying. Cities ripened on these threads like fruit on a trellis. Their streets carried the sound of copper on stone, the clatter of shutters as morning pride eyes open, the bargaining song that needs no school, the slap of wet clay on a wheel, the whistle of a boy thread through the feet of men who had forgotten how to be boys. Courts nested at their centers, all angles, and ceremony. Temples kept a slower heart nearby, smoke standing blue in the shade. Execution grounds kept the law's last sentence sharp. Gardens let officials practice the mercy of pruning. Schools taught the stubborn miracle that a character is a net large enough to hold a thought without bruising it. The arts rose not as ornaments to power but as its measure. Music proved whether a time was in tune. If bells disagreed with flutes in the palace, farmers would soon disagree with taxes in the field. Poetry tested the joints of speech and found where policy had left splinters. Painting released mountains from the need to be climbed and taught officials how to see distance while sitting. Calligraphy made the law beautiful enough to fear and sometimes gentle enough to obey. Drama borrowed masks from the shrine and let villagers rehearse victory and loss without widows. Crafts became vows. A pot fired true was a kept promise. A robe whose hem did not fray before winter was fidelity. A bridge whose planks did not sing under a troop's weight was prudence. A sword that took and kept an edge was memory obliged to act. When such vows were kept widely enough, the realm leaned forward into unity as a man leans into a wind that finally pushes and supports at once. Unification arrived like noon, sudden only to those who had not watched morning. Measures reconciled their disputes, roads forgot their quarrels with mountains, coins learned to carry one face without complaining. The script tightened its bones so that meaning could walk farther without stumbling. The sovereign at the center gripped the skein of these agreements and pulled, and the knots of local pride, after one last show of teeth, slid. He made the map flatter and the world taller, flatter by smoothing the jealous bumps of petty crowns, taller by throwing up works that taught the horizon to respect human will. Long walls tasting the north wind mile after mile, causeways across marsh hard enough to carry a court, terraces on slopes where harvests had never stood before, tombs whose silence out-talked 100 speeches. His reign burned like a kill stoked too hot, and the pieces it fired were both strong and brittle. When the firing ended, some cracked with a quiet that was worse than breaking. Yet the glaze remained, and later hands shaped vessels from the same clay and found that a lower flame made a longer life. The long peace that followed did not sleep, it watched. Garrisons blinked steadily along exposed edges, the post road counted hoofbeats into law, the granary door opened to relief before rebellion. Governors learned they were gardeners and not butchers, most of the time. With calm came reach. Caravans took silk past thirst and brought back horses that could eat distance. Emissaries read the manners of foreign courts like weather and came home with both honors and maps rewritten in their heads. Instruments listening to ground and sky made calamity a little less sudden. Physicians tamed fevers with quiet hands. Paper let letters cross weeks in a day and bound the provinces with a thread of ink. In such noon the dangers of shadow gathered like dust in corners. Offices congealed into families, families mistook their rooms for the house, taxes thickened beyond the appetite of justice, armies grew tired of borders they had held too long, the court's attention turned inward and began to graze upon itself. Drought and flood, which had never agreed to abdicate, walked through doorways left open by distraction, and the people reminded their masters that heaven's thread can cut as well as bind. Rebellions lit and guttered, some were sparks put out by a sleeve, some were fires that found the dry rafters of a dynasty. Foreign riders appeared where the map still swore they could not, and their laughter sounded like the lesson of grass. Yet every falling house left something standing that another could use, a canal that refused to forget how to carry water, a text that refused to spoil, a craft that refused to lie, a right that refused to be orphaned. Thus decline became inheritance and the spiral turned without snapping. Through it all the people kept their smaller empires whole, a courtyard swept before dawn, a jar sealed with care, a prayer set down like a stone at the threshold, a child taught to bow and speak his name, a daughter taught to keep accounts that do not cheat even in hunger. From such governments of the ordinary the greater realm borrowed breath when its own failed, and from such breath it learned to stand again. What endured was the habit of giving shape where shapelessness threatens. Flood becomes canal, war becomes boundary, grief becomes festival, memory becomes stone, silk, and script. And when strangers walk among these survivals they hear the old language without needing a teacher, the bell's long sentence pronouncing order, the road's straight intention, the wall's refusal to forget the north, the plow's argument for spring, the poem's way of making justice visible. So the tale circles back to its first materials and finds them tempered, clay that has learned law, bronze that has learned music, jade that has learned mercy, silk that has learned patience, wood that has learned how to outlast itself with lacquer's help. From such lessons the realm composes its next beginning, and though the names of kings change and the banners fade and return in other dye, the ground keeps the script of furrow and foundation, and the river keeps the refrain that men translate into calendars and vows. The household remained the first school and last court, and in its rooms the realm rehearsed itself each dawn, a mat unrolled with care, a pot set to simmer before the courtyard light was full, a brush dipped so that a boy could copy the bones of characters until his wrist learned humility and certainty at once, a girl weighing the dyes for silk until the hue of river at dusk could be coaxed into cloth, elders teaching with silence when words might bruise, with proverbs when silence might fail, with stories when even proverbs could not reach. Lineage bound the living to the dead like a rope with many knots, each knot a rule not to be cut but to be understood. A son's bow to a father taught him how to stand before officials, a daughter's obeisance to the hearth taught her how to command a household without raising her voice, and the seed of the state lay under such roofs long before banners were stitched. Festivals braided the year into a wreath that did not decay, a lantern carried through alleys where winter breath smoked from mouths in white plumes, spring drums waking fields and courting rain, summer rites persuading pest and fever to walk elsewhere, autumn feasts where the first bowl went to the unseen and the second to the eldest and only then to the hungry, boats chasing the moon on rivers so black and bright the oars seemed to write on mercury, kites stitching bright script across a blue so thin it might tear. Markets after sunset turned law into music, vendors singing weights and measures into trust, firelight turning steam to gold above cauldrons, dice murmuring luck on rough boards, storytellers rescuing history from sleep, magistrates runners walking their slow patrol not to frighten but to remind the city that a visible eye can be gentle. In the workshops behind shutters, knowledge ripened in the dark, recipes for glazes guarded like inherits, alloys whispered from father to son until the metal poured like certainty, timbers joined so tightly that floods admired them, inks mixed to outlast generations of hands, papers sized to accept breath without fuzz or smear, perfumes for rights held secret as true names. On coasts the wind itself enrolled as teacher, sails learned the speech of tide and current, keels learned the grammar of long swells and short chop, pilots read stars that had been shepherds to caravans and made them servants to hull and rope, and harbors became notebooks written in salt and gull cry where spices and lacquers traded rumors as eagerly as they traded places. Frontier towns learned two kinds of courtesy and could switch between them before a stranger finished tying his horse, one for riders whose hospitality came with a question, one for officials whose hospitality came with a receipt. Shrines there welcomed both steppe gods and river gods and asked them to share rice without quarrel. Wives there sang two kinds of lullaby, one that smelled of leather and smoke, one that smelled of soy and hot stone. The road between village and capital taught another lesson, that power travels not only by order but by imitation. A clerk in a distant hall copied the dignities of a man he would never meet. A farmer bent his back with the same timing as a distant regiment because both obeyed the season's drum. Governors planted trees along the post road knowing they would shade men they would never command. A widow who kept her husband's tablet clean taught a prince more about loyalty than 100 speeches could. When the realm ached, it did not groan all at once but in places, and healers went to those places the way a physician's fingers go unerringly to the rib that will not cease its complaint, a canal that silted stubbornly, a tax that turned into a quarrel rather than a duty, a clan whose pride remembered a century too much, a commandery whose garrison loved its horses but had forgotten the names of villages it protected. Remedies were old and new at once, dredging that made a river remember its youth, amnesty that made a rebel remember his country, marriages that tied grudges into vows, a careful famine law that opened granaries without teaching sloth, a ceremony that gave a new title to an old virtue and thereby brought it into fashion again. Scholars in plain robes sat with their knees tucked under them and read syllable by syllable until wisdom became not a flash but a habit. When they passed from student to examiner, they carried the habit outward and made it gate and path for men whose talent might otherwise have died behind a plough. If a generation faltered, the next learned to walk by leaning on the rails those men had set, and the rails were sentences that had survived floods and fires because they were carved not only on bamboo and silk but in the powers of the heart. Art turned inside out the landscape that had authored it. Mountains came to the city in ink, and river mist in a sleeve of gauze, and the temper of old pines in the cut of a poet's line. A garden behind a wall rehearsed the country for those who could not leave their posts, borrowing a boulder from a dry streambed and making it into a cliff, borrowing a ripple of tile and making it into a cascade, borrowing the call of a dove and making it into distance. The strongest houses learn to admit weakness into their councils, for a beam that will not flex is one storm away from shame, and the rulers who lasted longest allowed themselves to hear farmers and ferrymen when augurs and generals went deaf. When foreign embassies bowed in the great hall, they saw more than lacquer and carved beams. They saw a choreography that had survived so long that it wore patience like armor, a logic of gestures that could turn enemies into guests by giving them a place to stand and an hour to speak, gifts heavy enough to flatter and light enough to leave them wanting. Those embassies returned with the realm in their eyes and remade their own court so slightly that only old men noticed, and thus influence traveled farther than banners and outlasted alliances. Meanwhile, beyond the mountains, younger peoples measured themselves against the wall's steady refusal and learned endurance. Some learned it so well that they rode through gates not as raiders but as heirs, carrying a winter's clarity that the summer kingdom needed. Such arrivals were first felt like a fever and later remembered like a transfusion. The realm woke changed, a little taller in the saddle, a little quicker to smile, keeping its handwriting but adding a new flourish no one could now imagine living without. In each age the craft of governing risked forgetting that it is a craft, then the earth reminded it with flood and dust, and the people reminded it with their stubborn preparedness. Seed saved past prudence, rafters braced beyond code, small shrines kept where great temples forgot their own names. The countryside could be counted on to survive the city's mistakes, and the city could be counted on to singularize the countryside's wisdom into forms portable enough to travel. Between them the realm crossed bad weather. At night, when courts slept and garrisons counted their watch, the true map shone for those awake enough to see it, not the one on silk in the archive, but the one in a ferryman's callus, in a herb woman's basket, in the way a magistrate's runner knocked 3 times and then twice and then paused so a frightened household could put on dignity before opening. Children born into such a web learned their lines by playing in it. A boy who chased a hoop down a lane learned the slope by heart and would later judge a wall's footing with the same instinct. A girl who made boats of leaves in a ditch learned the cunning of water and would later measure a dam's stubbornness by the sound it made at night. The pair of them would meet as adults across a counter, a petition, a marriage mat, an oath, and the country would gain another seam it could trust. When death came to the famous, it came also to the unknown, and the rites that wrapped a general's coffin wrapped a potter's bones more lightly but not cheaply. Both were guided with the same lamps past the same places where the living must say goodbye, and the living learned from the equality of that last march what justice might mean on this side of the river. Thus, without declaring it aloud, the realm trained itself to prefer repair to novelty, continuity to astonishment, measures that worked to gestures that merely dazzled. Even its wonders wanted to be useful, a tower that watched more than it boasted, a bridge that bowed slightly to the current as a good host bows to a guest, a wall that did not pretend to be forever but managed to persuade whether it had time. Yet when the time for daring came, the same hands that had mended and measured could also improvise, a floodgate raised in a moonless storm because the river spoke a logic that charts had not predicted, a levee reversed at the last hill because the wind made ally of a wheat sea, a treaty signed under a tree with the ink of rain because the parchment had flown. The people's praise for such acts was not loud, it was the simple decision to keep faith 1 year more, to plant again, to send their sons to the drill yard without bitterness, to keep the altars supplied even when anger wanted to withhold smoke. By such votes the realm renewed its charter with itself. Old age came as it always does, on little feet, and the empire, which had once written its name across mountains as if clay were soft forever, learned to speak lower. Seeing its reflection in lakes that had watched other crowns glitter and vanish, it practiced a kind of graceful piety, codifying what could be saved, forgiving what could not, placing in the hands of monasteries and schools those things that soldiers cannot carry, melodies, parables, recipes for understanding. Towers fell without taking down the streets beside them, and walls opened gates where once they had set teeth. Rivals who might once have burned a library instead copied it and claimed descent from its shelves. Exile became curriculum, and return became compromise. When the last banners of a house drooped in rains that would not stop, the people did not mistake weather for judgment. They went on lighting lamps in niches blackened by generations of smoke and kept the faces of their ancestors clean with cloths dipped in boiled water and patience. The next house rose from that warmth like a spark raised by bellows. It did not need to invent a country, only to remember it with enough strength that the remembering could feed everyone. And so the long song continued in a lower key but with surer pitch, gathering courage not from novelty but from the certainty that a bowl shaped 1,000 years ago still sits comfortably in the hand, that a character traced by a lantern-lit student can carry a law across counties, that a bell's tone can braid men's intentions into a single strand for the time it sounds and a heartbeat after. In that strand the great and the small held together, a river engineer's notch on a sluice gate, a midwife's knot on a cord, a tax clerk's notch in a tablet, a mason's notch in a cornerstone, for small cuts in different lives mapping one decision, that the world is to be made coherent, not merely endured. From such insistence, empires rise and fall with less terror than they might, and civilizations earn the right to speak of themselves as if they were one person learning to be wise. Night after night the sky kept its silent court, and men learned to keep calendars from the way certain stars rose earlier than their neighbors, and the moon rehearsed her circuits with an obedience that put courts to shame. On terraces where dew made footprints silver before dawn, watchers marked the lean of shadows on gnomons and taught the fields to expect water on days when water would bless and to rest on days when water would mock. And so the year became a harness rather than a storm. In halls where oil lamps breathed as softly as old animals, scribes copied the bones of speech until meaning itself felt oiled, and those copies traveled farther than a general in one lifetime, stepping from hand to hand until even far provinces shared a pulse. Boys rose from rough benches with wrists that no longer shook and went out to weigh disputes or tally grain or command men because their brush had first taught them to command their own impatience. Gardens turned thinking into rock and water, a corridor that bent like a poem, a pavilion that leaned into a lake just enough to taste it, a path that disappeared behind a pine and reappeared under a bamboo grove so that the walker understood how power should vanish and return, a borrowed view of hills beyond the wall that taught officials to consider what lay outside decrees, and in such rehearsals the state learned to speak without raising dust. Tea cooled the tongue of argument and lent the mind a gentle edge. Porcelain took the color of mist and held it until lips believed dawn could be drunk. Kilns beat like hearts in valleys where clay knew its destiny, and a bowl thinned at the rim until it became a promise that would not break in ordinary sorrow, only in the kind of sorrow that breaks more than bowls. Along river stairs slick with moss the oarsman's chant stitched towns together, and the wharf at dusk spoke all dialects at once in the grammar of need and offer, while inland the caravan bells answered with their own syntax of distance and risk. Between boat and camel knowledge moved like a cautious animal, sniffing each camp for danger before curling by the fire, and by morning it belonged to a new household without forgetting the old. Hunts at the borders taught kings humility before weather and horse. Frost could make a sovereign's breath seem mortal, and a hawk that would not stoop reminded princes that the world keeps a few decisions for itself, yet the meat brought back to the capital tasted of the outer air and seasoned counsels with a freshness no proverb could supply. In siege years, when drums walked the walls before men did, the city listened inward to its small intelligences, midwives whose hands turned breech births, millers who heard stones grow tired, smiths who knew when iron needed kindness instead of force, and these kept the city from falling even when the garrison doubted. Later, when peace returned, the same hands made festival, proving that survival is not a grim talent but a generous one. Temples stored a quieter wealth than treasuries, hoarding minutes paid in kneeling, hours paid in fasting, days paid in service, and that wealth went out invisibly during famine and panic, in rice measured shyly in the dark, in a word that untied a knot in the mind, in the loan of a name to a man whose own had been damaged. Such traffic left no tally but accrued interest in the stability of neighborhoods and the refusal of streets to forget how to be kind. On the step the wind kept its clean handwriting and taught visitors to read speed and horizon. Those who learned returned with new saddles in their souls, with an appetite for space that palaces could use if they were wise, and sometimes the palaces were wise. The empire put on a coat of felt beneath its silks and found winter easier, put a bow across its shoulders and found its posture improved. In copper districts the mountain wrote wills in veins that men interpreted with picks and prayers, and when a seam failed the village learned to move as if it were a single animal searching for pasture. In forests where resin sweetened the air, carpenters coaxed impossible spans from timbers that had stood listening to storms for a century, and bridges learned to step lightly over torrents as deer do. The law kept finding smaller rooms to live in, a standard for weights that could fit in a pocket yet keep a market honest, a marriage contract short enough to memorize, a tax remitted by bowing at the right season because the bow announced truth more convincingly than a chit. When the law grew too large it trembled and dropped leaves until it was itself again, for the people disliked shadows they could not see through. Physicians observed breath with the attention generals gave to banners, they mapped pulses as carefully as magistrates map districts, and their maps opened roads that knives could not. They asked the patient what he feared and found that fear often answered before disease did, and where fear lived stubbornly they set a stool and listened until fear tired and wandered out to look for a less polite host. Songs walked farther than couriers and cost less than horses. A melody could cross a river by the mouth of a ferryman, climb a pass on the back of a goat herd, slip through a checkpoint in the throat of a child, and by the time it entered the capital it had learned to sound like home. The court, hearing it, sometimes believed it had invented mercy. In drought the old rites tasted of dust but still worked. In flood the same rites tasted of mud but still worked. The people did not mistake ritual for lever and yet found that ritual adjusted levers men could not see, and that was enough. When prisons filled, amnesties came like rain. When edicts multiplied, a silence from the terrace thinned them. When border alarms howled too long, a marriage calmed them with a single tent raised in both camps. When harvests overflowed, granaries creaked graciously but inspectors creaked more loudly, reminding those who counted that abundance is merely famine standing on tiptoe. Scholars grew old around the same paragraphs and did not resent them. The paragraphs changed as a path changes through use, becoming truer to the feet that needed them, and the country trusted such sentences because they had acquired the polish of many sleeves and the dents of many arguments. A maxim carved in a beam outlasted the men who sat beneath it, and a boy who read it while hiding from a scolding might later quote it at a governor without irony. When the capital burned, capitals always burn. The river carried away ash and brought back silt, and builders mixed the silt with straw and made bricks, and masons set the bricks where the fire had been, and the street remembered its old route and did not hold a grudge. The people moved their gods a lane over and continued the conversation interrupted by flame. In the high offices, where ink turned to command, there were seasons of blindness and seasons of sight. A blind year sounded like edicts that contradicted their own shadows, like horses pushed past sense, like drums that could not agree on a beat. A year of sight sounded like accounts that balanced and slept well, like roads repaired before complaints arrived, like widows whose names were known at the granary door. Between them the nation learned to breathe with two lungs, one of patience, one of temper. On coasts where fog braided itself into daybreak, shipwrights argued with the sea and sometimes won. A new curve to a hull made waves treat the boat like kin, a new stitch in a sail taught wind to share, and a new knot gave rope the manners of silk. Such victories were never final, and the sea collected its dues, but the ledger stayed in favor of those who respected tide without flattering it. Foreign quarters in river towns smelled of pepper and pitch, and their boys took their first lessons in otherness, that a beard might hide courtesy, that a strange oath might hold better than a familiar one, that an alien god might accept rice with as much dignity as a local one, and these lessons softened future wars by teaching the hand how not to fumble when confronted with difference. In the oldest cemeteries, weeds grew with tact, not obscuring names, and children played with the seriousness appropriate to such places, running without shouting, hiding without forgetting they were guests. There they learned that time is not a wall to be kicked but a guest room to be swept before leaving. And always the artifacts returned to speak for those who could no longer raise a voice, a jar lip worn by 1,000 fingers setting it down, a bell whose tone could find the old center of a courtyard even when the courtyard had moved, a seal whose impression on clay still contained the small tremor of the hand that pressed it, a coin's square heart telling the round world it must remember the earth, a comb with missing teeth that still kept a kind of order, a bead drilled imperfectly that had nonetheless crossed mountains and made a throat beautiful. From such survivals, dug up or handed down, the tale takes its next breath without starting over, for the past in this land is not behind but beneath, and the footfalls of the living ask permission with every step and receive it with every answer the ground returns. Workshops in back lanes taught night to be useful, and the city woke to the smell of quenching and paste, of rice steam and ink, while the village woke to damp earth and the slow tilt of water down a furrow. Mothers counted stitches as if they were days, fathers weighed seed as if it were judgment, and children learned measures by tying knots in cords until the knots themselves became a language. The cartwright listened for the pitcher wheel should sing before it would consent to carry distance. The cooper tapped a cask until the staves agreed to be a circle. The mason placed his palm on a stone to ask whether it wished to lie down or to stand, and by such private conferences the public world gained reliability. At crossings where dust lay deep as a page the magistrate's runner paused long enough to let rumour spend itself, then entered markets where sellers called justice by its first name to see whether it would turn its head. And out of these trial conversations law took on a human voice that could be recognized even in a storm. In alleys where lanterns swung like patient fruit the storyteller's breath stitched catastrophes into coherence and clipped heroes to a size that a child could wear, and so disaster lost its appetite and courage lost its vanity. In barracks, sleep was rationed but hope was drilled, a cadence that let men carry fear like a bundle rather than like a flood. And on the day the banner rose the bundle could be set down without shame. The canal inspector, who had seen drought teach prayer its own limits, carried a rod scored with old heights and made the river remember them, and when he opened a gate at night the dark water behaved because it had been addressed by its childhood name. Midwives marked the skins of newborns with tiny smudges of soot to hide them from jealous wanderers in the unseen, then washed them away at sunrise when the house had earned a day's protection. And from such rituals of modest size a nation learned to step past panic. In monasteries a novice swept a corridor so thoroughly that dust learned courtesy, and the abbot, measuring the boy's bow, knew whether a village would have its next schoolmaster, because piety and attention to corners are kin. On watchtowers the night guard drank tea that tasted faintly of iron and rain and counted the north wind's ribs, and if hooves answered he beat a rhythm that moved through sleeping houses like a hand finding shoulders in the dark. And even those who had nothing to fear sat up and straightened their blankets because order is its own comfort. A widow in a wine shop kept a book without numbers, faces remembered, favors exchanged, griefs honored, and men who had once mistaken strength for noise found themselves speaking lower when they crossed her threshold, and left with a better opinion of the country than the court had earned that week. On feast days the city's drums did not drown the village's flutes but braided them, and a boy from a hamlet heard his own lane inside the capital's thunder and was not afraid. Beyond the last fields, where reeds bent to an older music, The marsh granted passage to those who spoke its grammar of wait and patience, and messengers who learned that grammar came home with maps not yet scratched on silk but already exact in the legs. The plague that visited every century like a creditor was met not only with prayer but with clean water and distance and the sacrifice of affection for a span of days, and when it left, the memory of who had carried food to whose door sat in ledgers no treasurer kept. Famine, when it crossed the threshold, was asked to sit while granaries spoke with gods and governors, and in that pause a road was cut, a tax forgiven, a marriage arranged that made two lean provinces one tolerable province, and the year shifted from black to grey. In war years the courtyards learned silence that was not surrender, and small gardens fed platoons of endurance, while letters crossed lines in the pockets of women whose errands were too ordinary to search, and commanders who mistook the ordinary for the harmless discovered that patience is the sharpest blade in the sheath. In peace, arrogance fattened itself on easy victories over petitioners, then thinned when a single rain collapsed a new bridge because its joints had been counted in coin instead of in conscience, and the builders who replaced it returned to the old arithmetic of span and current and shame. In the mountains elders read snow the way fishermen read tide, and told the valley when to expect less water than promised by the sky, and the valley believed them, and so a quarrel did not ripen. In foreign streets a book of poems printed from carved wood found a dinner table and then a palace, and a century later a proverb that began under a paper mulberry leaf returned as policy hammered into bronze, and the circle closed without anyone calling it a circle. The palace itself learned to breathe, expanding its rituals to admit sobriety after victory and restraint after disaster, and when it forgot, the countryside reminded it with a refusal to be dazzled, for the Plough's verdict on government cannot be bribed. The road crews set milestones not only to measure distance but to measure promise, and if a stone fell a report walked in ahead of the next petition, and a governor whose milestones lay face down could not keep his hat straight. In the schools a boy failed twice and succeeded on the third attempt, and when he was old he failed 3 students who would have paid to pass, and the country, which can smell such economies at a mile, planted trees along his funeral road. In the border garrisons a mediator with a scar for every clan taught 2 languages to a son who would later halt a war for 3 weeks with a joke told at the right fire, and those 3 weeks were enough for the harvest to come in and for the war to die of embarrassment. On the steppe a girl rode with a bow as if it were a second spine and later married into a valley where the loom spoke a speech she learned as quickly as she had learned wind, and the cloth she wove kept her family warm through a winter that would have broken pride if not bone, and so a custom from grassland learned to sleep beside a custom from river bank without baring its teeth. A courtesan taught a minister something about mercy that his books had failed to persuade him of, and he wrote a law with a hidden hinge that spared 1,000 boys from the execution ground over 20 years. And no chronicle credited her, but the hinge turned true. A general who had known only victory met weather and learned humility, returned his troops thirsty but unbroken, and when he died his horse nosed the hems of mourners until the right man stepped forward, and the court could not argue with that selection because animals do not flatter. In a prison yard a poet scratched a line into a brick with a bone pin, and a century later a mason rebuilding that wall read it and set the brick in a place where rain did not strike, and so the line persisted and fed a stranger. A village that had burned 3 times planted paulownias because they grow fast and refuse grief, and the 4th fire found a different map, and the 5th never came. Taxes went out one spring with a softness that surprised the counters because the previous winter a governor had gone in person to the floodplain and carried an old man on his back to the ridge, and the troops saw it and The clerk saw the troops see it, and the realm, which calculates even when it sleeps, entered that fact upon the hidden ledger where credit never spoils. When the last snow melted on the last hill, the river shook itself like a dog and went back to work. Barges bullied each other under bridges with affection that sounded like oaths, and the city, forgetting its last panic with the kindness one grants to a dear fool, arranged its stalls under awnings that flashed like fish, and the day declared itself ordinary, which is to say victorious, and in all this the old beginnings sent up their green heads, clay that still took a handprint like a blessing, bronze that still answered mallet with character, jade that still forgave heat and prized patience, script that still taught breath to behave, bells that still remembered how to catch disorder by the ear and lead it through a courtyard without humiliation, so that the present could continue to walk on the shoulders of what it pretended to have outgrown, and the road ahead, seen from the terrace where elders sipped the last tea, looked very much like the road behind, seen from the same place when they were boys, which is either comfort or warning depending on how a man holds his cup. Courtyards learned to carry thought the way a body carries breath, and so the city became a grammar of roofs and shadows where music, story, and craft could speak without permission. Painters unrolled mountains that a minister might climb with his eyes when duty chained his sandals to the Capitol, brush hairs splitting at the tip to lay mist thin as patience along a ridge whose rock was a single stroke sure enough to outlast a dynasty. And in those painted distances pines leaned with the moral weight of old friends, while water found the logic that officials were meant to learn. On silk and paper the empty space said as much as ink, reminding the hand that what is unsaid holds the room in which the said can stand upright, and so the best lines carried stillness inside them the way a jar carries air. Carvers taught wood to remember wind by following the grain until the grain forgot it had ever been tree, and in the curve of a screen a winter hillside waited. Snow called under lacquer. Like a promise, potters who understood heat as other men understand mood watched the kill's mouth go from straw to peach to plum and knew when clay would accept its destiny, and out of the heart of fire bowls rose thin enough to tremble when 2 syllables of a poem fell near them, yours whose spouts poured like the neck of a heron, dishes so pale a moon could hide in them and be discovered only by lips, weavers set rivers and clouds into brocade, threading cranes whose wings looked ready to leave the garment if a door opened to the east, while plain hemp, dyed with indigo dark as fields at midnight, spoke of mornings when wealth is a warm bowl and a pair of shoes without holes. The lute learned to make grief useful and joy modest, fingers walking strings until they found a tone that could stop an argument at 3 houses distance, and drums taught feet to remember what hands had promised at the altar. Planting and harvest and marriage held to their measures by sound, in alleyway. Theaters are demons masked frightened children and instructed adults by exactly the degree of its ugliness, while sleeves wide as sails caught the gestures by which history turns into instruction, and a villain's laugh, honed by a lifetime, became a civic service. Tales learned to travel lighter than tea and yet refresh as deeply, a woodcutter's kindness outsmarting a magistrate's cleverness, a bride persuading ghosts by offering them the first dumpling, a monk defeating a demon by outweighting it. And from such parables the city's pulse took a calmer beat. Stone learned to bloom into guardians at temple gates, lions whose jade pupils were drilled just enough to admit a glint and send boys home with quivers of courage, and pagodas lifted stacked eaves like a set of reasons ascending toward the patient blank of the sky. Bells rang not to command but to straighten the line between ear and heart, a single deep note tidying a courtyard's confusion until thought stood in ranks like well-bred bamboo, and in that tidiness a widow remembered a debt, and a clerk remembered a promise, and a soldier remembered he was also a son. Calligraphers hid their tempers in the discipline of stroke order until the page repaid them with a freedom invisible to the careless, a sweep that made a law kind, a hook that made a refusal final, and masters could tell a man's honesty from the way his brush lifted at the end of a vertical. Incense wrote slow sentences in air that even the illiterate could read. And at altars where the smoke curled just so the gods, if they need ceremony, were patient, and if they need sincerity, were satisfied. Tea rooms taught the empire that waiting is a craft, water just below the boil so that leaves can confess, bowls warned so that the tongue is not startled, cups turned so that the hand remembers to be humble, and while steam braided itself with talk, decisions decanted their bitterness and kept only their clarity. Gardens were composed with the same economy as poems: one rock a mountain, one rill a river, one twisted pine 10 winters, and the path arranged to teach a minister that haste is merely a poor route. Walkers learned to see where they were going by discovering where they had been, and from that lesson policy sometimes borrowed mercy. The market itself was an orchestra that tuned at dawn and played through dusk. Hawkers' calls setting tempo, coffee-colored soy bubbling a counter-melody, knives flashing brighter than opinions but not drawing blood, and haggling, in which both buyer and seller must keep face, became a conservatory where a people refined the art of disagreement without enmity. Paper turned memory featherlight and contagious. Woodblocks multiplied voices until even small villages could hear themselves spoken back to themselves, and in cheap print a ballad could grow a spine strong enough to push a governor toward decency. Children traced characters with water on hot stones, watching their lessons vanish as they wrote, and learned thereby that virtue must be refreshed more often than law. In the northern lane storytellers tasted snow, and in the southern lane storytellers tasted salt, yet both chose endings that left the listener with a tool rather than a tear, and so the realm did not drown in its own sentiment. Foreigners brought instruments whose voices at first offended the local ear and then, after a season, taught it new harmonies, while motifs on textiles borrowed a mountain from far away and married it to a river at home until no one could swear which ancestor owned the pattern. In mountain monasteries inkstones sat like small ponds and welcomed the brush as if it were a crane come to fish, and monks, who had left their surnames behind, taught their breaths to carry the empire's fatigue without commentary. A cook in a village with 2 spices invented a third by putting them in the right order. And a century later a court declared the sequence orthodox and built an etiquette around a stew. Craftsmen swore oaths to tools, promising to keep edges honest, handles smooth, joints shy but strong, and the tools repaid them by cutting only what was meant and refusing to embarrass hands. Shipwrights along the coast gave pine and cypress a second life in hulls that understood the grammar of waves, sewing planks edge to edge with tendons tough as old friendships. And when a storm tore the sail, a mariner wrote an elegant sentence with reef knots and came home willing to tell the sea that it had won this time. Masks for festivals remembered beasts that had vanished into time, their lacquer shine outlasting the wrist that painted it, and boys who laughed at them at noon grew solemn at dusk when the drum taught the mask to speak. Jade carvers counted years in dust that did not rise, fingers ablaze with patience, and a disc that passed from one neck to another in a wedding bound 2 altars as securely as law. On the frontier, where 2 scripts met over noodles, a letter learned to curve like mercy, and a proverb grew a second ending that made peace less expensive. Books of medicine remembered gardens with more accuracy than maps and taught households that boiling water is a kind of prayer, and the body repaid such piety by surviving winters in which politics forgot its manners. songs woven for the rowing stroke saved barges from becoming courts of complaint, and work that might have soured into resentment rose instead into chorus, and a coxswain at the stern learned that leadership is the art of keeping time more than the art of giving orders. Night markets made philosophy edible and cheap, offering dumplings shaped like moons, noodles long enough to flatter longevity, sweets that crumbled with exactly the tenderness required to soothe a child's failure at an examination, and grandmother's adjudicated taste with a firmness that kings rarely matched. Festivals taught astronomy to illiterates. A lantern on a pole becomes a star if lifted with conviction, and a river of lamps on the water returns the sky to itself so that the year can start over, and whatever the court thought of omens, the neighborhood's new renewal by the way applause moved through a crowd when the first light broke into 10, even punishments, kept to their proper size, taught craft, the public shame of a petty official for a petty theft restored proportion to a district more effectively than the spectacular ruin of a great man, which too often teaches only appetite, in the library, where dust made an honest perfume. A clerk patched a line in a chronicle with a conjecture so careful that it became truth by adopt. The hour of greatest reach lifted itself like a standard into a clear wind, and the realm moved beneath it with the assurance of a river in flood, not wild, not wasteful, but intent on filling every hollow promised by its banks. The center pressed outward along roads that wore the shine of use, relay horns passing breath from station to station so swiftly that a command could gallop from terrace to frontier without tiring, and with each order mileposts straightened themselves like soldiers. Called to attention, the northern plain learned a new geometry of forts and beacons. Hills found themselves obliged to host towers that spoke in fire at dusk and smoke at dawn, and along that long breadth of stone the winter riders met not villages but a line that refused to blink, a refusal supported by granaries whose doors opened toward the garrisons as loyally as toward the fields. Westward the road of thirst unspooled past oases where palms kept count of caravans by the scars their ropes etched in trunks. Embassies went out carrying silk the color of sunrise and returned carrying horses with cloud-fast legs, jade hard as judgment, glass that made light rethink its habits, stories that smelled of cinnamon and snow, and with the embassies went rumor of a kingdom at the edge of the world whose eagles ate iron for sport, of a sea that took a year to cross and returned sailors with hair white from astonishment, of merchants who sold shadows at noon in markets where shade was wealth. Southward axes spoke to jungles in a careful grammar of cut and weight. Rivers were persuaded to share their caprice with boats that learned how to flatter eddies and scold rapids. Fields stepped up hills on terraces that taught rain patience, and cities new to the calendar learned how to keep feast and levee without quarreling. Eastward the coast threw out piers like sentences ending in certainty. Shipwrights stitched the sea to the land with planks that remembered trees and nails that remembered mountains, and sails bellied with winds that looked like banners praising the empire in a tongue the sky could read. Courts at the summit of this noon learned a choreography whose smallest bow could steady provinces. The sovereign rose before dawn to face the four quarters with a gaze that had been taught to include every hamlet. Ministers delivered counsel that had been tempered in schools where boys boiled water for elders and learned that clarity comes at the same heat as tea. Generals knelt with hands scarred by reins and maps and swore to spend courage before they spent men. And music descended in tears from bronze frames to align hearts with measures that made both law and harvest plausible. Armies moved as if the earth were a drum they had rehearsed upon since boyhood. Chariots gave precedence to cavalry that could write in cursive on the steppe and print in block on the plain. Ranks of spearmen held their breaths until the moment when breath itself turned into spear. Archers loosed a dusk of arrows at noon. Engineers made hills kneel by cutting and filling and persuading stone with levers, and the standard at the center of all this, dragon coiling around a sun it refused to swallow, taught fear to the enemy and restraint to the friend. Clashes that would later be called epics arrived like weather fronts announced by far thunder, a dust wall on the horizon that resolved into banners and helms, a silence before the drum that stretched across leagues, a hawk frozen above the center as if weighing the argument, then the meeting of doctrines, swiftness that sought to unhouse formation, formation that sought to unnerve swiftness, until the field agreed with one logic and the other learned humility. Valleys kept such days in their bones, and every spring the grass remembered where not to grow. In halls behind the frontiers envoys with eyes like scales balanced courtesy and threat until both weighed the same. They offered mirrors and asked for peace, offered peace and asked for horses, offered daughters and asked for seasons of quiet so that the south could be terraced and the west could be bridged, and when words failed the road learned again how to carry iron. Monuments rose that did not flatter time but confronted it, stone fitted so tightly that centuries could not insert a rumor, galleries where clay men stood forever at attention with the patience of soil taught to wear human shape, walls whose shadows moved like sundials across the conscience of the north, canals whose level faces reflected not only clouds but the intention that had made clouds serve seed. These works told the living that they were not merely passing through the country but making it accumulate. The name of the sovereign at the crown of this ascent rode on coin and decree into pockets and courtyards where no royal foot would ever stand, and yet the sovereign did not walk alone. Sage words, age to the sweetness that instruction requires, tempered command, farmers' proverbs pricked the pomp of plans that forgot mud, craftsmen's measures corrected ministries, and songs from ferries revised edicts with the authority of need. Markets proved victory by swelling without fear, bolts of cloth unrolled like tame rivers, scales consented to balance day after day, spices wrote their alphabets on the tongue, smiths promised edges that would last past winter, paper multiplied hand and mind until a village could read itself into courage, schools proved victory by promoting boys on talent rather than lineage often enough to keep hope fed, temples proved victory by not begging, granaries proved victory by spoiling at the edges. For lack of famine. If the empire had a character then, it was the calm of a man whose belt fits because he works and eats in season, he sits straight because walls stand, speaks low because bells can be heard, gives alms because granaries have lint, sends sons to drill because borders are honest about danger, and his daughters write letters that travel farther than his feet and return with marriages that widen kin without losing center. Rivers took the news of this noon outward, bearing barges that laughed together at shoals they had conquered last year and would conquer again next, and on their banks artisans etched the confidence of the age into everything that could carry pattern, roof tiles that argued with rain and won politely, bridles that taught horses to respect softness, belts that reminded officials where their middles ought to be, boxes that hid poems from the indiscreet, needles that made thrift noble, lamps that flattered ink, wheels that declined to wobble even when the road told stories. Pride followed, as it always does, a half-step behind achievement and humming the same tune an octave too loud. The court learned the taste of victory and then the habit of it. Some ministers began to love triumph in the abstract more than justice in the particular. Some generals kept their saddles too long and heard only drums even in rain on a roof. Some tax tallies mistook the granary's patience for the peasants. Some prefects polished the emperor's mirror while letting their own grow cloudy, and small creaks sounded in beams that had seemed made of certainty. Border riders, watching the long walls back turn to sunset, counted torch intervals with the accuracy of heirs and taught their sons where the patrols would be thin when the crops failed, and in the south the jungle, which never concedes forever, began to take back paths not sung to daily with hoe and foot. Yet the empire's high noon could not be denied its blaze. Roads went out and came back without being stolen by distance. Laws reached prisons and granaries with the same strength as palaces. Engineers tamed a river long enough to lift a city into safety. Doctors learned to scold fever with cool fingers and managed to keep the army standing through a summer that had wanted it to sit. All this entered the people's sense of themselves and made them walk like men and women, aware that their steps were part of a procession begun by ancestors and expected by descendants. The enemies at the edge learned new manners or new graves. The friends learned new protocols for gifts that meant more than they weighed, and the merchants learned new sums that included risk and duty without cheating either. The realm's name, spoken in 100 tones from reeds to brass, traveled with caravans and ships until even strangers made space for it in their mouths, and the realm, hearing itself echoed in alien syllables, believed for a moment that it might be equal to the sky in duration. But every summit carries in its snow the water that will undo the ice. Victory's very roads make rebellion's march easier when it comes. Walls trained to relay alarm can relay panic. Towers that watch the horizon can be used to measure how fast the center forgets its edges, and an army at ease remembers the softness of cushions more keenly than the hardness of saddles. In palaces where silk had learned to whisper louder than sense, the habit of ceremony began to eat the substance of rule. In provinces where governors had learned to sign with a flourish, the hand forgot how to hold a plough or a spear, and the winter riders who once fled from torchlines learned to ride alongside them and then between them when the shifts grew lazy. Omens that had rested began to stir, floods that found levees neglected by officials too busy with entertainments, droughts that found canals silted by accountants who counted their own advantage first, locusts that found fields defended only by prayers said without attention, and among the people, who know weather better than ministers do, a quiet arithmetic began. How many bowls of grain a promise is worth? How many sons a border is worth? How many bows before an altar it takes to stiffen a back? And when that arithmetic changes the shape of a country, banners learn in a day what sages tried to teach in a lifetime. Even so, the hour of noon kept its dignity, light slow to move, shadow gentle in its arrival, and men who had stood with the sovereign on terraces looking out over a realm that seemed to have no opposite remembered to walk down the steps carefully. In their memory the empire's greatness remains not as a trumpet but as a bell, one perfect note rolling outward over plains and rivers, waking towers and fishing boats alike, entering kitchens and armories with equal right, and in that note other seeds of the evening to come, not bitter, not frightened, but inevitable, because the force that built roads also built returns. The will that raised walls also raised gates, and the mind that united provinces also taught them how to miss one another when the ligatures loosen. From that acceptance of the day's curve the tale passes, as light passes, into a lengthening of cool along the edges of fields, a slight reproof in the wind to hats worn too high, the first lamp being trimmed in a hall where victories are painted, and far away a farmer listening to frogs and thinking of taxes, which is how great stories enter their last chapters without shame. decline thickened not as a single blow but as an accumulation of unheeded details, canals silted by one more year of postponement, patrols that shaved a watch by a single bell and made a habit of it, tax lists that added a line to those who had nothing left to list, courts where ceremony multiplied faster than harvests, and a horizon that learned the color of smoke too early in the season. Border riders tested torch lines and found gaps where a steward had turned vigilance into a stipend. River gods took back their borrowed patience after levees went untended. Locusts rehearsed their black script over fields that had forgotten how to read wind, and the countryside, which forgives much, began a quiet arithmetic in which loyalty must answer hunger or be marked absent. Factions formed within silk walls as if threads had decided to stray, ministers polished mirrors for the sovereign while clouding the wells, generals loved drums more than maps, scholars defended paragraphs while neglecting the sentence that holds them together, and the eunuchs who kept the palace's breath steady discovered they could choke and soothe by turns. Rebellions rose first as rumor in tea shops and then as banners in wheat, led by men who promised to reset the calendar so that justice would remember what month it is, and though many were liars, some were useful, for a bad ruler learns from fear what he would not learn from counsel. The north sent its winter again with horses for snow and arrows for wind, slipping between beacons, galloping along the logic of grass. The south folded jungle over roads like a closing hand. The west shut passes in storms and opened them to strangers with better provisions. The east took ships that had not learned humility, and what the empire had held apart for centuries met its heart with a familiarity bred by long practice at the edges. Capitals burnt with the decency of dry timber, quickly, completely, leaving courtyards that remembered where steps had been and nothing more. Archives smoldered into ash fine as caution and traveled farther in a day than their authors had in a life. Granaries opened late and found accusation where gratitude should have been. Temples gave rice by night and were thanked by morning with lines too long to sustain. And through the smoke walked a truth older than banners, that no wall stands where its foundation has been eaten from within by the small teeth of negligence. Dynasties, which had looked like mountains from below, revealed themselves as caravans from above. Camps set and struck, loads shifted, songs changed to keep feet moving. One house fell to intrigue but left a law that lasted. One fell to famine but left a canal that refused to forget its duty. One fell to invasion but left a script that did not concede pronunciation even as accents wandered. Each collapse rehearsed a lesson the next reign recited with better or merely different diction, and the country learned to survive rulers by cultivating the loyalty of things that do not argue: dikes, paths, proverbs, family altars, the habit of measuring twice. Assimilation worked the other edge of the blade. Riders who once took cattle learned to take examinations, married daughters whose dowries included not only silk but the patience to sit through rites, brought their own sky-wide courtesy to halls that had grown cramped, taught old capitals how to breathe cold air without sneezing, and took in exchange a taste for gardens and the knowledge that law is a fence you put up against yourself before you put it up against your neighbor. Their grandchildren read with the same mouth that their grandfathers had used to sing to the step and, reading, dreamed different victories. Climate shifted its weight upon the land in ways no edict could correct. Rivers wore new beds like new tempers, rains forgot appointments, frost arrived uninvited to banquets of green, and whole districts learned exile without leaving their county lines, moving uphill with seed or downhill with goats until the map looked like a murmuration of starlings, life turning and tightening around needs that kings noticed too late. Civil wars arranged their tragedies with a bureaucrat's neatness, levies drawn from the same farms meeting each other in the same valleys under different flags, cousins scribing death warrants for cousins with the same steady brush, cities surrendering to one name at dawn and another by dusk because granaries preferred truce to purity, and when the last banner of the last claimant sagged in rain, no one could quite remember which virtue had won, only which fields had been spared. In the long aftermath, the country returned to its durable religions, the ditch and the calendar, the oath and the bowl. Houses put their beams back up with a thrift that honors wood, markets reopened with scales recalibrated by hunger, schools found teachers among those whose ambitions had been defeated into wisdom, and temples resumed their traffic in consolation, which is to say in the right words said at the right moment over a bowl of hot water and a handful of rice. What remained, once the clamor had drained away, was the shape the people had always preferred, language arranged like terraces to catch the rain of meaning, a script that allowed a farmer's grandson to address an ancestor across centuries without shouting, stories that walked from ruin to ruin carrying a steady light, architecture that argued gently against time by getting time to agree to small postponements, music that could be played by four men in a courtyard at dusk and be recognized by fishermen and princes alike, the ceremony of honoring the dead that teaches the living how to stand. The empire's cities left ribs in the earth, foundations that mapmakers decades hence would mistake for rivers until a spade corrected them. Its roads held their lines under weeds like old debts under laughter, and travelers centuries later would walk upon a new pavement and feel beneath their feet a more exact intention. Its walls, even when quarried for humbler houses, communicated a refusal useful to any home. Its bells continued to persuade courtyards to behave, its jade remembered throats that had sworn fidelity and asked new throats to do the same. Its bronze vessels, lifted from damp earth into foreign light, gave the present back a forgotten measure and asked it to pour without spilling. Later people spoke the old name with their own mouth shapes and meant by it what they needed: discipline, mystery, abundance, patience, and built their own houses against that weather. Scholars bowed to the ruins as to teachers and bowed to the texts as to judges, and what could not be taken from the country, its appetite for coherence, its respect for small exactitudes, its conviction that meaning is a kind of craft, traveled outward to men and women who would never see the rivers that had invented it. So the ancient realm persists where endurance always does, in recipes and rites, in the way a mother lifts a bowl when she sets it before a child, in the way a craftsman tests a join with the pad of his thumb and not his fingernail, in the way a magistrate pauses before the stroke that makes punishment into law, in the way a farmer measures the sky with his breath before he dares the first furrow, in the way musicians glance at one another for a courage that is not noise, in the way a pilgrim leaves a small coin where the stone is worn smooth by gratitude, in the way the dead are named at the year's turn so that sorrow remains a citizen and does not become a king. The palaces have changed their roofs, the banners have changed their colors, the borders have redrawn themselves so often that the map now looks like water thinking, but the grain still ripens along lines learned when the world was young, and the characters still carry a little sun in each square heart, and the bells still know which courtyard they are speaking to. If there is an end to such a story, it is only the end of one breath before the next begins, the pause in which the listener realizes that the land itself has been the narrator, and that it will continue whether or not the throne is occupied, for clay remembers fingers, bronze remembers fire, jade remembers patience, water remembers the bed it once lay in, and people remember how to be themselves by doing again the modest, exact, enduring things that made them.